This episode of the My Latin Life podcast is brought to you by Bitrefill. Bitrefill is the best way to spend your crypto in Latin America. Purchase gift cards or mobile refills from more than 3,500 brands in 186 countries instantly, safely, and privately. Visit bitrefill.com for more information. Welcome back to another episode of the My Latin Life podcast. Since 2014, My Latin Life has been your trusted guide to traveling and living in Latin America. Today's episode is a different format. We're going to be mixing it up. This is a solo episode with just me, just Vance, and the theme of today's podcast is Mexico versus Paraguay. I've been requested multiple times by people in the Telegram group to compare Mexico versus Paraguay, to compare other countries too, Panama versus Paraguay, etc. So, dedicated episode, Mexico versus Paraguay. And you might be thinking, what? Mexico versus Paraguay? These countries have nothing in common. And on some level, that's true. But they're two of the most popular countries for digital nomads in Latin America. And one of the common themes is that these two countries have some of the best residency programs in all of Latin America. Why? Because Mexico and Paraguay are some of the only countries in Latin America, and really some of the only countries in the world, where you can maintain legal residency in the country with minimal to zero physical presence, meaning you don't even have to spend 1 day a year in the country to maintain your residency permit, and that allows you to basically have residency in Mexico or Paraguay as a backup, or at least something to set up in advance, right? So maybe you're not willing to make the move yet to Mexico or Paraguay, you got things to take care of back home wherever you are. Well, still just get the permit now, get the residency now, and then you have it there in your back pocket in a plan B scenario, or just a couple years down the road when you retire or whatever it is, right? So that's probably the unifying theme of Mexico versus Paraguay. Obviously, they're both Latin American countries. Obviously, they both speak Spanish. But the real common theme is they're just the best two residencies. And actually, I would say to anyone listening to this that it's really not a one or the other situation either. And you're actually better off just getting both, right? So get residency in Mexico and then also get residency in Paraguay. There's really no downside to having both. Cool? By the way, probably a good time to mention that we can help you get residency in Mexico and Paraguay. So you just got to get in contact with me through Twitter, through Telegram, email, mylatinlife@gmail.com. Any way you want to get in touch, and we will put you in touch with lawyers, trusted lawyers that we have that execute on these programs. And we've seen them execute on these programs many times for people from all countries, Canada, US, Europe, wherever you're from, you will be able to get residency in these countries. Cool. So without further ado, I've made a list of some of the topics that I'm going to run through in the episode. So the residency programs, tax, language, transportation, walkability, roads, food, culture, the cities, bugs, things to do, nightlife, dating, gyms, weather, prices, friendliness, beginner friendliness in terms of like, is it a good country if you're a beginner, beginner traveler, medical freedom in terms of vaccines, etc., nomad community, expat community, entrepreneurial community, tech community, right? I think that's a pretty exhaustive list of themes, and we'll see how many I can get through. First solo episode, so bear with me here. So where should I start? Where do you guys want me to start? Drinking some wine here. So let's start with the residency programs and go a little bit more into detail. So Mexico residency. Mexico has a larger variety of programs, I would say, where you can apply from within Mexico or you can apply from your home country via your local embassy or consulate. The bar is quite low, but Mexico does have requirements when applying from abroad. These are basically independent means requirements in terms of you're going to need an income, you're going to need a salary, or you're going to need a very large bank balance. It depends on how old you are and which country, which embassy, which consulate you're applying from. Even within the United States, there are different requirements depending on which consulate you go to. Insider information tells us that the consulates in Texas are actually easier. They have a lower barrier to entry where they say, okay, you only need about $2,500 or $3,000 of income per month, whereas some of the other consulates, maybe, I don't know, let's just say New York City, they want to see more income per month, right? They might want to see 3,500 or 4,000. The numbers change, so I don't want to give exact numbers. I want this episode to be relatively timeless, or at least, what's the word? Anyway, but you get the idea, is that you need to check the local requirements where you live. And if you're going to be applying from abroad, typically you need to apply where you live, or at least where you have an address. So check what your local consulate is and then optimize for that. So there's a couple ways to get in, whether it be income, whether it be having a bank balance. You can have a bank balance of $100,000 or $200,000 if you've maintained that balance for 6 months. That can often be enough. So it could be income, it could be a bank balance, it could be pension income. So there's a couple different ways to do it, but you do need to show some sort of independent means, right? That's when you are applying from outside of Mexico. Inside of Mexico, the thing is, you're typically not supposed to apply from inside Mexico because you're supposed to just be on a tourist visa, and typically you wouldn't really be there long enough to apply for a visa. That being said, there are ways. The most famous way is what's called the regularization process, or a regularization visa, where the original idea of this is something that came after 2020, where they said the general idea was, if you cannot go home to your home country due to vaccine mandates in your home country, let's just say you're Canadian and you're stuck in Mexico because you can't fly home to Canada because you can't get in because you don't have the vaccine, well, you can stay in Mexico and you can apply for regularization and get you can get residency in Mexico that way. Now, this program was supposed to be phased out, and it's largely phased out, or it's not as common anymore in late 2023. But word on the street is they're still allowing it to happen in certain places. Word on the street says it's still happening in Mazatlan. It's still happening in the Mayan Riviera, right, in Playa del Carmen and Cancun. It might still be happening in Baja California. So get in touch with Big Papi Vance, and we'll put you in the direction of a city in Mexico where they're still doing regularization. Technically, you could do it yourself. I don't even know if you could do it yourself, actually, because this program is barely even supposed to exist. So I would definitely, so scratch that. I would definitely use a contact. Well worth the money. Another thing I would mention is that regularization has typically been giving people longer residency permits. So you're always going to start on temporary unless you're retired, unless you're over age 55. It might be possible to start on permanent. But if you're under 55, you're going to be starting on temp. And the typical path of independent means where you're applying from outside Mexico, they're typically giving you 1 year to start. And then after 1 year, you renew for another 3 years. And then after 4 years of total residency in Mexico, then you can apply for permanent residency, right? Whereas with regularization, they've been giving people 4-year residency permits off the bat, which is pretty crazy. And then after 4 years, you simply renew as permanent, right? So that saves you a renewal process. So you might be thinking like, what? If I apply in Mexico, I get 4 years. If I apply outside of Mexico, I get 1 year. Yes, there's a couple rules around regularization. where they need to see that you have had previous entries into Mexico between like prior to 2021 or prior to 2020. They've kind of moved the goalposts on that a bit, but basically you need to have previous entries into Mexico to show that you've had a history of spending time in Mexico, even on tourist visas. And then with that kind of history of travel to Mexico, that helps your case towards regularization. So if you're listening to this and you've basically never been to Mexico, you cannot just show up and get the regularization. There's a couple more steps or a couple more concepts to regularization, but honestly, I think they're going to be phasing it out real soon. Might be one of the last couple of months that you'd be able to get in on that. So, you know, really the real path is applying from outside of Mexico. So that's really where your focus should be for the most part, unless you're a really big action taker. Okay? All right, let me drink some wine as we move on to the next topic. Okay. So that was a bit of a rant about residency in Mexico and some of the options there. How does it work in Paraguay? Well, the way it used to work was you would deposit $5,000 in the Central Bank of Paraguay, and that would be sort of your independent means. And then, long story short, you would get permanent residency in Paraguay. This program was canceled about a year or a year and a half ago. It was canceled, I believe, sometime in 2022. And so they put, the history of it is they kind of put like a 6-month pause on all residency applications. And then they recently restarted the program, and now you do not any longer need to deposit the $5,000 in the central bank. They have removed that step, but you have to start as a temporary resident. There is no longer a path to permanent residency unless you go through this other program. It has an acronym. It's escaping me right now, but you have to invest $75,000 into Paraguay. And if you're willing to invest $75,000 into Paraguay in an active business, in a real business, not a certificate of deposit, it has to be a real business that actually employs people, then you can start off with permanent residency. So that is an option, and we can help people with that too, but most people aren't going to do that, and most people would rather just show up and start on temporary residency. And yes, you can basically just show up and ask for residency. There are no requirements beyond simply having a clean police check and a birth certificate. All you need to do to get residency in Paraguay is show up with an authenticated birth certificate and an authenticated police check. Okay? Apostilled and authenticated. That's all you need. With those two documents, you can request residency in Paraguay. So you no longer need to invest. You no longer need to have $5,000. Forgot to mention there was another path where instead of having $5,000, you could bring a diploma from a 4-year university. So that used to be another way. You no longer need the diploma either. All you need to do is show up with the correct documents, birth certificate and police check. Another difference of Paraguay versus Mexico is in Mexico, you do not need a police check. All you need is your birth certificate and, maybe one or two more other things. But Mexico is one of the only countries in Latin America, and I think maybe even one of the only countries in the world, where you can get residency without demonstrating a police check. What is the benefit of that? Obviously, if you have misdemeanors, if you have felonies, Mexico's a great country because, it removes a lot of uncertainty. In Paraguay, you can still get residency if you have misdemeanors. With felonies, I don't know. But if you have misdemeanors, you can still do it. But it might take a little bit longer, right? They might want to do additional checks. They might want to do like an Interpol thing, blah, blah, blah. So it might take a little longer. But if you have minor crimes, I guess you could say, you can still probably get into Paraguay, especially if you're willing to pay up a little bit of money. Wink, wink, nod, nod. But that's one benefit of Mexico. It's one of the only countries where you don't need a police check. And really all other countries in Latin America, run through the list. It could be Ecuador, could be Panama, could be whatever. Every country is going to ask for a police check. Mexico is basically the only exception to this. And honestly, it makes things very convenient because, let's just say you did Ecuador, for example. You have the police check, you have the birth certificate, cool. But here's the thing. When you want to renew your residency 2 years later, 3 years later, 4 years later, whatever, they're going to ask for another police check. Same thing with Paraguay, probably. Yeah, I'm actually pretty sure. So Paraguay, you're going to get the 2-year residency. That's how it works now. You get 2-year temp. Paraguay, you get the 2-year temp. I don't need my Ecuador example. I can use Paraguay as an example. But so you get your Paraguay residency with just the police check and the birth certificate. And then when it comes time to renew it 2 years from now, you're going to need a new police check. So which will probably mean you have to go back to your home country. You got to get your fingerprints taken again. You got to get it apostilled again or authenticated again. You got to bring it to the Paraguayan embassy or consulate again, right? It's the whole process. So it's just a little bit annoying. So yeah, so that's the whole thing about police check versus no police check there. Okay, hopefully that's enough information about residency. Let's move on to some other stuff, which we get into next. I'll leave tax for later. No, let's do tax right now. It's kind of related to residency. Okay, so another big topic, taxes. Everyone wants to know about taxes. So Mexico and Paraguay are both very good for taxes in the sense that you can have legal residency without having tax residency. So if you really just want to have either of these countries as a plan B, you can get the residency in Mexico or in Paraguay, and you're not necessarily a tax resident. Now, there might be some reasons you want to become a tax resident in one of these countries, and we'll get to that in a second. But it's very important to mentally distinguish that legal residency and tax residency are two separate concepts. There are other countries in the world where they are one and the same. In Canada, if you are a legal resident, you are also a tax resident. In Brazil, if you are a legal resident, you're also a tax resident. But in Mexico and in Paraguay, legal residency and tax residency are separate concepts. So in order to become a tax resident, you first need to become a legal resident. But it's very possible to be a legal resident and never ever become a tax resident, right? So just understand that those things are different. Now, most people who follow the Twitter, follow the podcast are probably pretty savvy on these things, and they're probably aware that Mexico is a residency-based taxation country, whereas Paraguay is a territorial taxation country. What this means is if you are a full-time, let's just say tax resident in Mexico, you should be paying taxes on your worldwide income. That being said, Mexico kind of has a unique system because they need to be flexible for retirees and they need to be flexible for expats. So I would say really among all the residency-based taxation countries in the world, such as Canada, such as most countries in Europe, Mexico is actually quite flexible because they use what's called a center of life test. And I could really get into it. That would be a whole podcast in and of itself. But just know that Mexico is actually pretty flexible. But even though it's flexible, Mexico's not a tax haven. It can be flexible. It's possible to live there even more than 6 months a year without becoming a tax resident, without owing taxes. But you're kind of getting close. You're kind of like scratching up against the line, right? And it's not a tax haven. And for most online entrepreneurs and digital nomads, you're better off having your tax residence not in Mexico, and you're going to want your tax residence somewhere else, such as a Paraguay, such as a Panama, such as another territorial tax country. So that's somewhere where I would say that Paraguay definitely has a huge advantage over Mexico, is Paraguay has a much better tax system because Paraguay is a territorial tax country. In other words, it's basically a tax haven. And your foreign sourced income is not taxed in Paraguay. You're only taxed by the income that you generate or earn within Paraguay and kind of on the money that you repatriate or bring into Paraguay. But that's another topic. But long story short, from a tax perspective, Paraguay is a country where you would want your tax ID or where you would want to have tax residency. And Mexico is somewhere that you do not want to be a tax resident, right? And Paraguay definitely wins in that category. Definitely a whole topic in and of itself. I would recommend that you guys, I just launched a paid private Telegram group. It's called Latam Insiders. We do weekly Q&As. And if you want to join this program, there'll be a link in the show notes so you can join the paid Telegram group, and we do Q&As, and you can ask me more specific questions about this stuff as it relates to tax residency. But that's probably enough on tax for this episode because I did have a long list of things to get to, so we'll get into some other fun stuff too. Okay. This episode of the My Latin Life podcast is brought to you by Language Blend, the new best way to learn Spanish. Language Blend focuses on what you actually need to live and get by abroad with daily one-on-one lessons, a dedicated texting partner. It's like living in a Spanish-speaking country without ever leaving home. Go to languageblend.com for more information. Okay. Next one, fun one, random one. The roads. This might seem ironic or weird, but Paraguay actually has better roads than Mexico, which I was surprised to note on my most recent visit to Paraguay. The roads in Mexico are pretty bad. Like the potholes are pretty bad. It's bad in the cities. It's bad on the highways. The roads just aren't great. And it's so funny that a tax haven country like Paraguay actually has better roads because they really, would have less tax money, right? Because, they're collecting less taxes. It's, that was my segue from taxes into roads. But funnily enough, the roads are better in Paraguay. And that kind of brings me to the thoughts around the infrastructure in general. I would say that infrastructure in Mexico is definitely overall better, but the infrastructure in Paraguay is probably better than you expect it to be. You probably think Paraguay, that's got to be some third world type stuff. Honestly, it's really not that third world in a lot of ways, and the infrastructure here is very good. The one thing I would say in regards to infrastructure about Paraguay, actually both countries, is that Paraguay gets very hot in the summer. And reminder, this is the southern hemisphere, and so the summer is from December to about March. And in between December and March in Paraguay is unbelievably hot. We're talking 40 degrees Celsius or over 100 degrees Fahrenheit every single day. It's very hot. It drops at night, but it's still very hot. It's very hot and it's quite humid. It's quite tropical here. And so due to that, there's a lot of stress on the electric grid because everyone is running air conditioning, right? You could not survive in Paraguay in the summer without air conditioning. It's friggin' hot. And so all the stress on the electric grid leads to blackouts. And so it's actually quite common to have blackouts or, that the electricity goes out in Paraguay. The electricity will also go out in Mexico. The electricity can actually go out in pretty much any Latin American country a lot more often than would happen in Canada or the U.S., for example. But in Paraguay, it's seasonal to the summer. And then Mexico is actually, honestly, it's like almost a tie, because in Mexico, it's not that the electricity will go out, but the Wi-Fi can go out in very strong rains. So I guess that kind of depends more where you live in Mexico. You know, you're gonna have stronger rains, obviously, in more tropical areas. Whereas if you're in the north or drier areas or Mexico City, this will happen less. But if in Mexico or really any Latin American country, you might be surprised to know that when it rains very heavily or where there's some kind of tropical storm, the Wi-Fi can go out. And obviously we all need Wi-Fi to work for the most part. So just something to keep in mind that in Mexico, the Wi-Fi is more likely to go out in the rainy season and I guess also in the summer, which kind of overlap. And then in Paraguay, it's going to go out in the summer. So it's kind of the big thing about infrastructure, I would say. I'm trying to think what else. The tap water is slightly more drinkable in Paraguay. In Mexico, you cannot drink the tap water anywhere in the country. Technically, maybe some buildings in Mexico City, you can drink the tap water if the building invests in a filter at the building level, but at the city level, you can't drink the tap water in Mexico. And then in Paraguay, also I wouldn't overly recommend it, but it's doable. Because in Argentina and in Uruguay, you can largely drink the tap water. And so I think Paraguay's kind of picked up on that kind of, Chile as well. So I think Paraguay's kind of picked up on that Southern Cone standard of having somewhat drinkable tap water. So the tap water is drinkable here, especially if you just boil it once. Like I've been here a couple weeks now on a visit in Asuncion. And kind of funny story. The first night I arrived at like 4 a.m. You know, all the stores are closed basically. And I'm just like, I need water. And the doorman in my building was like, oh, you can just drink the water, but I'll bring you ice. I'm like, what? So I can just drink the water from the tap? He's like, yeah, but, you know, it's hot out. I'll just bring you ice. And so the doorman brought me a bucket of ice, and I was just drinking ice and tap water. What I've been doing, though, is I've been boiling it once. So I have like a hot water boiler thing, an electric kettle. And so I'll boil the water once and then let it cool down, put it in the fridge, whatever. And yeah, I've been good. I've been fine. And actually, if you hear this wine with ice I've been drinking, it's just water that I boiled once and then, you know, poured it into the ice cube tray and then put the ice cubes in my glass. And I would definitely never do that in Mexico. I would never, ever boil the water in Mexico and then drink it. Some poor people do this, not to be condescending, but just because they don't have money to spend on water. But it's not a good idea. It's really not a good idea. You really got to buy bottled water in Mexico. And I was kind of pleasantly surprised to know that I could drink a little bit of tap water here in Paraguay, because it's definitely convenient. At least for like washing fruit and stuff, it's so convenient, because when you're cooking, when you're washing fruit, when you're, you know, washing dishes, all that stuff, brushing your teeth, it's just good to be able to have at least like semi-drinkable tap water. Obviously, it tastes terrible and has like a chlorine taste or whatever, but at least it's base level drinkable. Okay. What's next? Walkability. So I guess walkability kind of feeds into infrastructure. I would say overall, Mexico is a little bit more walkable. Asuncion is walkable. Asuncion's definitely walkable. I've definitely heard a lot of times on Twitter and in Telegram people saying that Asuncion is not walkable. It's definitely walkable. But if I had to give a country the walkability prize, I would definitely give it to Mexico. Now, both countries, the public transportation is pretty crappy and actually a little bit dangerous. And I would not recommend public transportation in either country. But both countries are walkable. and then both countries have cheap Uber. I would say that ride sharing is arguably slightly more developed in Paraguay, whereas every major city, Encarnacion, Ciudad del Este, Asunción, has ride sharing. It has Uber, it has Bolt. And in Mexico, some cities have it, some cities don't, right? Cancun, Playa del Carmen, Tulum, the whole Riviera Maya does not really have Uber. The state of Veracruz does not have Uber. Tons of places in Mexico actually don't have Uber. I would say only about half of Mexico has Uber. And so in that sense, Paraguay takes the cake in terms of ride sharing. And then walkability might be almost a tie, but yeah, I'd probably give walkability score to Mexico. What's next? Transportation, flights. I mean, clear winner. Mexico's way, way more connected. That should be obvious. With the potential exception that if you are European, it's closer to a tie. Because if you are European, it's actually quite hard to fly into Mexico City. There's more flights to Cancun now. Like a couple of years ago, there were not that many flights to Cancun. I think like Paris was like one of the only cities that flew to Cancun. Now, post-pandemic, there's a lot more flights to Cancun, which is actually the easier entry point into Mexico from Europe. It's pretty hard to get a good flight to Mexico City, and any European flight to Mexico City is like really expensive, like surprisingly expensive. And a lot of the flights connect through the States, which isn't the worst thing, but connecting through the States is not easy because a lot of people don't have visas for the U.S. And you also, I think you have to, like for Europeans, you have to do the ESTA, kind of like the visa on arrival thing, even just to pass through the airport in the States. So transferring through the States is not ideal, and direct flights to Mexico from Europe are pretty hard to come by. Whereas with Paraguay, a lot of the flights, if you're flying from Europe, would probably go to Sao Paulo, and you would have a simple connection like Lisbon, Sao Paulo, Paraguay. So it ends up being closer to a tie. Like arguably maybe Mexico's closer, but pretty close to a tie. Obviously, if you're Canadian or American, Mexico's the clear winner, and Paraguay is a slog. Like it's pretty hard to get to. So what does it look like to fly to Paraguay? There's a couple different ways, but the most common ways you're going to transfer in Panama or potentially in Bogota. There are some transfers in Lima, Peru as well, and a couple other ones, like it's technically possible to transfer in Santiago. I'm trying to think where else. But really the most common flight path is you're going to transfer in Panama or potentially in Bogota. And so you're looking at about 4 hours flight time to Panama, and then another 6.5 hours from Panama to Paraguay from Canada or the USA. On the flip side, it keeps all the tourists out, right? Because there's just not that many tourists because it's just so far to fly to. So you're not going to have a lot of... there's no bachelor parties here. Let's just say that. There's no bachelor parties in Asunción. So it's kind of nice to be in a place with no tourists because then you don't have tourist scams. You don't have, the downsides of tourist-heavy locations. So people just treat you normal here. And they actually half the time think you're like a Jesuit missionary because otherwise there's not that many like normal people in their 20s and 30s that are just like normal digital nomads or expats in Paraguay. So they think you're like a missionary. But yeah, from a flight perspective, obviously Mexico's closer. And the other thing I'd say to that is that if you live in Mexico, people will visit you, right? Like people will come, especially in the winter. Like If you live in Playa del Carmen, you will have people visiting you every single week. If you live in Mexico City, you will have people visiting you every single week. If you live in Paraguay, nobody is ever coming to visit you. Your parents will visit once every 2 years if you're lucky. Whereas if you live in Mexico, your parents will visit once a year, once every 6 months. Your brothers will visit more often. Your buddies from your hometown will visit more often. So if you're in Mexico as a North American, people will visit you. You'll feel more connected. You'll be able to go home for birthday parties and all that stuff. But if you live in Paraguay, you're not really flying home for a birthday party. You're probably not even flying home for a wedding unless it's like your closest friend of all time, right? So not, you got to keep that in mind, right? Is, the visitability. Okay. Next one is food. So you might think that Mexico is the clear winner for food, but I'd actually say it's closer to a tie than you might expect. So Mexican food is pretty ethnic, quote unquote, right? You got tacos and quesadillas and all this stuff, flautas, and it just seems very foreign to a Canadian or American from the northern United States. If you're from Texas or something, or Arizona, maybe it's a little bit more common, but if you're from New York or Boston or Toronto or Montreal, Mexican food definitely feels very different, right? And it's just, it can be intimidating, let's just say. Like, Mexican food's a little bit intimidating. And even to this day, I'm still, like, discovering new foods in Mexico that I've, like, never heard of. So Mexican food is the winner. Like, it's a little bit better, but it's closer than you think it is for a couple reasons. So the food in Paraguay is going to seem more similar to an expat or to someone from North America or Europe. And the reason for that is because, it's a lot of steak. There's a lot more steak here than chicken. So it's a lot of, burgers, steak, and then there's a lot of influence from Argentina and Brazil. This is one of my favorite things about Paraguay, actually, is so you get the very best foods from Argentina and you get the very best foods from Brazil. So, with Argentinian food, you got wine, you got red wine, which I'm drinking right now. You got espresso, you got empanadas, all different types of empanadas. What else? Pretty good pizza. There's actually quite a lot of Italians in Paraguay. So the pizza's quite good here. Good luck getting a decent pizza in Mexico. Literally impossible unless you're in Mexico City. But you go anywhere else outside of Mexico City and maybe Playa del Carmen, and you're not getting a decent pizza. You're not really getting a decent hamburger. And so in that sense, Paraguay food is like more Americanized, I guess you could say. Regarding like Brazilian food, so they got acai, which I love. Very hard to find acai in Mexico. And other Brazilian foods. You can get coxinhas here. A coxinha is kind of like an empanada, if you're not familiar with it. Really good. It's just like, $1 a pop. It's kind of like a Brazilian empanada. It's in like a teardrop shape, and often has chicken in the middle. Really good, really good. So it's pretty cool about Paraguay that you can get coxinhas, you can get empanadas, and just like a lot of different foods from Argentina and Brazil, and also Italy because the Italian immigrants. And then a lot of German foods here too, because you probably might be aware of that Paraguay has a lot of German immigrants. So you can get schnitzel and sauerkraut and all that weird German stuff that I'm not really into. Actually, we went just the other night. I was with the guys. Went to this like German-Russian restaurant. So they had all these Russian foods that I wasn't familiar with. But they had borscht, and all this type of stuff. I know I had another point on this. Oh, and Paraguay also has this local food that kind of comes from the indigenous Guarani population, and a lot of it's really good as well. So they have certain soups. Like they have this like caldo de surubi. Surubi is a type of fish, so they have this like a couple different fish soups. Then they have another one called vori vori, which is a chicken soup, which is really really good. And then they have all these other kind of local Paraguayan dishes. There's this one called embeju, which is kind of like cheese and flour that's fried, and it's actually really good. I'm trying to think what else. Sopa paraguaya is pretty famous. It's not a soup. It's like a sort of like a cornbread. And so on and so on. So long story short, there's a lot of different Paraguayan foods as well. It's all good. It's all really, really good and cheap and stuff. I guess probably worth mentioning pricing on the food. I would arguably say that food in Paraguay is cheaper. Especially, obviously, steak is cheaper here. I'm trying to think what else. Wine is cheaper here. And I think just food overall is cheaper in Paraguay, just because Paraguay is cheaper overall. So I would say that, the cost of food is cheaper in Paraguay than it is in Mexico. It's certainly not expensive in Mexico by any means, but I would say food is cheaper in Paraguay. Another thing about food, okay, so let's just rank like the food groups. So meat, Paraguay wins. Dairy products, I don't know, probably Paraguay wins. I mean, cheese isn't really a big deal here. No, actually, no, dairy products, Mexico wins for sure. You got like queso Oaxaca and stuff. Dairy products, Mexico wins. Fruit, I'd say is probably a tie. Fruit's probably a tie. Maybe, actually, I'll give fruit to Mexico because they got avocados. I would say fruit is a tie. Fruit I'll give to Mexico. What else? So vegetables, I might actually give it to Paraguay. Here's the thing. Here's the point I was trying to get at, is that Paraguay is more of an exporting nation, an agricultural exporting nation, whereas Mexico obviously does have food exports, but since it has such a large local population of like 110 million people, that it's not as export driven as Paraguay is, because Paraguay is bigger than California, but has only like 6.5 million people. So Paraguay is a big food exporter. So lots of stuff comes here. Soya exports, chia seeds, peanut butter. The peanut butter is way better here than it is in Mexico. Sesame seeds, all different types of seeds or nuts like almonds, cashews, ciruelas like prunes, lots of stuff. I would say like Paraguay exports a lot of food. Yerba mate, obviously. Coffee is better in Mexico. Obviously, for coffee, Mexico wins. But Paraguay is really solid for food. It's very cheap. You can eat very cheaply here. You can eat well. The food will feel familiar, whereas in Mexico it's a little bit more intimidating. I mean, a lot of people might ask, what about American imports? So there might be some special foods that you want from the States. And you might think that Mexico is the clear winner in terms of imports. But Paraguay might win in some categories of food imports. Let me expand on that. So there's actually a lot of Koreans here and a couple different Asian ethnic groups. So in some ways, it might be easier to get Asian food here than it is in most parts of Mexico. Like if you want to get, I have no idea, like kimchi or like, I have no idea. Oh, rice. They're huge rice exporters in Paraguay. So rice is going to be a lot cheaper here than in Mexico. Italian food, as I mentioned, like if you want to get like certain cuts of Italian food, or like certain pastas, like, you know what I mean? The word's escaping me, but if you want like certain specialty imported Italian pastas, that actually might be easier to get here in Paraguay than it is in Mexico, because Mexico is really all about Mexican food for the most parts. Maybe there's some American imports that are easier to get, obviously, such as macaroni and cheese, or I have no idea what. But I know it's pretty hard to get peanut butter in Mexico, and it's pretty easy to get here. So it's kind of a tie. It's kind of a tie. But just, you know, long story short, Mexico probably wins, but Paraguay is actually a lot better for food than you might expect. Hey guys, quick interruption to tell you about Bitrefill. Bitrefill is the best way to convert your crypto into gift card balances. These are gift cards that you can spend at hotels.com, Airbnb, Nike, and many more. You may remember Joel Valenzuela, previous podcast guest. He's been living on crypto exclusively since 2015, and he's a big consumer of Bitrefill. And so I asked Joel, I said, what do you like most about Bitrefill? He said that he likes the instant delivery, the precise amount so that you don't have to juggle a lot of gift cards, and he loves the global selection. Nobody else has this much selection of gift cards, over 10,000 gift card options across hundreds of countries. Go to bitrefill.com to sign up, and you can also use the code MyLatinLife for 10% back off your first purchase. Go to bitrefill.com for more information. Okay, what are we hitting on next? Cities, variety of cities. So Mexico obviously has a much larger variety of cities. It's a country of 110 million people versus only 6 or 7 million people in Paraguay. But I would say that Paraguay is a more diverse population. I guess that's a different argument. Like Mexico obviously wins in terms of variety of cities. You have tons of different cities of different sizes. You have different vibes. You want mega city, you go to Mexico City, maybe Guadalajara, maybe Monterrey. You want something super chill on the other end, you can go to Tulum, you can go to San Cristobal in Chiapas. You have a million options for chill places. You have a million options for mid-sized cities, maybe a Puebla, maybe León, something like that. So Mexico is obviously going to win in terms of variety of cities and variety of vibes. But basically everyone in Mexico is Mexican. Obviously, there are some people from Argentina, there are some people from Venezuela, some people from Brazil, tons of Americans and Canadians, a little bit of Europeans. But by and large, when you're in Mexico and you're not in a tourist area or you're not in Mexico City, you're basically only dealing with Mexicans and a little bit of Americans and Canadians. But it's basically only Mexicans. Whereas in Paraguay, obviously for the most part, you're also going to deal with Paraguayans. But I would say that as a percentage of the population, foreigners make up a significantly larger percentage of the population. So what are the major foreign or ethnic groups here? Well, German, as I mentioned, is a very big one. Austrian, Swiss is a very big one. Russian is growing a lot, as you might imagine. Russians have visa-free to Paraguay, so a lot of people are coming here. Even prior to the war, a lot of people were coming here from Russia and Ukraine. Little bit of Americans and Canadians here, but actually probably definitely less Americans and Canadians than Germans. Who else? Well, there's obviously a lot of people from Argentina here, from Brazil. Huge Brazilian population here, which is awesome because then you can practice capoeira or you can go see a samba band or other Brazilian stuff, which is cool. What else? Actually, a surprising amount of Asians here. Paraguay is known for having a close diplomatic tie with Taiwan, and they've chosen to maintain diplomatic ties with Taiwan over China, which is something that's unique about Paraguay. And so you'll meet a fair amount of Taiwanese people here, and then also other Asian ethnic groups as well. So there's actually quite a lot of Koreans here and quite a lot of Japanese here. I think they originally came to sell cars and like domestic appliances, like microwaves and stuff, and then also I think maybe for religious freedom. Yeah, that's probably another podcast in and of itself, but suffice to say that there's quite a lot of Koreans, Japanese, and Chinese here, probably a lot more than you expect, and they have more of a presence here than you'll see in Mexico for the most part. I'm aware that there are Chinese people in Mexicali and, in Mexico City, but overall, I think the Asian influence feels higher in Paraguay, which might be surprising to some people considering we're a landlocked country in the middle of South America, very hard to get to from Asia. Okay. Trying to think if anything else I wanted to mention about the ethnic groups. Um, I kind of mentioned it too, but the Italians, which I like, like for Canadians and Americans, in Canada and the U.S., Italians make up maybe 5% of the country, 3 to 5% of the country, but they have sort of an outsized influence in terms of Italian cafes and restaurants and people who are half Italian or have the last name or whatever. And here in Paraguay, it's similar, where there are maybe 5% of the population, but they have an outsized influence. There were a lot of Italian settlers back in the day 100 years ago, because obviously Argentina and Brazil received a lot of Italian immigration as well. So same kind of thing with Paraguay. And there continues to be a fair amount of Italian immigration here and influence. And there's tons of towns that were founded by Italians and stuff. So I like that because they don't really have that in Mexico in terms of the Italian influence. And it's good because, like I said, you can get a decent pizza here. Trying to think what else. Mention the Asians, mention the Germans, the Russians, Americans. Oh, I guess in Ciudad del Este, there's actually a huge Arab influence, and there's lots of Lebanese people. And actually, just last week, I was getting a coffee here, speaking English to a buddy at a coffee shop, and some dude came up to me. He's like, "Yo, you're speaking English?" I'm like, "Yeah, what's up, man?" He's like, "Yeah, I used to live in Canada. I used to live in Edmonton, and I'm Lebanese." And I was like, "Oh, sick." He's like, "Yeah, man, if you come to Ciudad del Este, come by my electronics store. We'll hook you up with a deal." I'm like, "Sick, sick, yeah." But long story short, there's actually a lot of Arab people in Ciudad del Este, because in Ciudad del Este they kind of have it's the triple frontier. You guys are probably aware, and there's just a lot of trade in that region. Um, I mean, probably worth mentioning that there was even like a thing where the U.S. was accusing Ciudad del Este of harboring like Arab like Hezbollah groups and stuff like that, like terrorist groups basically. It's kind of like obviously that's kind of like a small proportion, is not totally representative of the Arab population there, but it's kind of like a funny story. But long story short, there's like a lot of Arab people in Ciudad del Este and in Foz on the Brazilian side. And even when I was spending time in Ciudad del Este, I was like going to shawarma places and getting like a good, authentic Arab shawarma. And then what else? Like I was even meeting girls and stuff that were like half Arab, and telling too many stories. But there was one girl that I was hanging out with that was like half Arab, or maybe even like full Arab, but she was like Arab Brazilian. And with her dad, she was speaking Arabic. With me, she was speaking English. Obviously she spoke Portuguese and Spanish as well. So it's pretty cool, right? I mean, it's just pretty cool, the kind of like mixing of cultures there. And we're talking, if I had to put a number on it, I think there might even be like 100,000. Maybe that sounds high. But like easily in the tens of thousands of Arabs in the Ciudad del Este area. All right, moving on. What should we do next? Okay, so also in terms of the people overall, Paraguay feels more European, or at least people have a lighter complexion. If there's any like woke social justice warriors out there listening to this who are going to clip this section, I'm sorry, but I'm sure people just want to hear like the truth of what this seems like. When you are in Mexico, Obviously, it depends if you are in the north of Mexico or in the south of Mexico. Northern Mexico is more European. Northern Mexico is more of a lighter complexion. People are taller. And then in the south of Mexico, basically south of Mexico City, people are more indigenous. People are shorter. People have a darker complexion, right? And you might be surprised to know that in Paraguay, even though people speak the indigenous language, Guarani, and it's a national language, Guarani, the Guarani language is important, the Guarani culture is important. People overall look more European here and have a lighter complexion. And so people just sort of, like, if you're, a white guy listening to this, from guy or girl from the US or Canada, people in Paraguay actually kind of look more like you, or at very least, like, you're more difficult to identify in the street as being a foreigner. Whereas in a lot of parts of Mexico, if you're a white guy walking down the street in a lot of parts of Mexico, it's very easy to immediately identify that you are a foreigner, just because of, like, the way you look, right? Whereas in Paraguay, because there's so much immigration from Germany and different places, whatever, people just look more European. Obviously, this will kind of feed into the dating market, where, yes, guys, I'm going to mention the dating market, even though I don't do this much, but I know people want to hear it. I mean, if you made it basically an hour into the episode, I guess you deserve it. So, how do I say this without getting in trouble? I think you guys know what I'm going to say. But basically, in Mexico, like I said, it kind of depends if you're in northern Mexico or in southern Mexico. Like, Mexico can really vary a lot per region in terms of how people look, the level of beauty of the women, etc. But overall, I would say by traditional beauty standards, Paraguay would win. Whereas you can go to a party here and just see, like, absolute stunners of girls here in Paraguay. And in Mexico, that's only going to happen in certain cities and in certain regions in the country, or at least in certain places it's more common than others. Right? Goddamn, I'm going to get in trouble. But let's just say that there's no way I can say this and not get in trouble. But let's just say Paraguay is punching above its weight. The average standard of beauty is probably higher than you'd think. And the women are actually more European style than you might think. I mean, I could obviously go into way more detail about this stuff, but I really can't for the sake of this podcast. Maybe this is another good time to plug the new private Telegram group, Latam Insiders, link in bio. Join the group, private Q&As with Vance. And if you join the private group, we can talk a little bit more about dating. Okay? Oy, oy, oy. Okay, moving on. Another thing I had was nightlife, a little bit related. What can I say about nightlife? So Mexicans party a lot. Mexicans party a lot. And in Mexico, you got tequila, you have mezcal, and a lot of beer consumption, and not too much wine consumption. Obviously, there's a little bit of wine up in Valle de Guadalupe, in Baja Norte, right up near San Diego and stuff. Whereas here in Paraguay, they drink different alcohols, you might imagine. There's definitely a lot of beer because, again, there's a lot of German influence, and a lot of Germans came here 100 years ago and established breweries. And so people love beer here. And they have it very cold because Paraguay is very hot, so they like the beer very cold. In Paraguay, you can also get a slightly different... And by the way, they have, like, really good German-style beers here, which you can't really get in Mexico. Like, in Mexico, obviously they have a bit of an artisanal beer market, but for the most part, it's just like straight lager. Whereas here, there's a lot of German influence in the beer making, and so they have, Pilsners, and they have all different types of beers here. So actually, I would say Paraguay punches above its weight in terms of beer. And what I was going to say is you can also get Brazilian style beers here, and they have a lot of the Brazilian brands here. So they have Antarctica, which is a Brazilian beer. They have Uru Fino, I think it's called, which is a Brazilian beer here. So they have a bunch of Brazilian beers as well. And they have the Brazilian style of beer, which in Brazil is called chopp, or here they just call it shop or chop, I forget. And it's kind of like a bit more foamy and very, very cold, which is cool. So I really like the Brazilian style of beer, and you can get that here as well as you can get the German style of beer. And then what else do they drink here? Well, quite a lot of imported wine from Argentina, because we share, or Paraguay shares a border with Argentina. So there's a lot of Malbec, a lot of imported wine from Argentina. Right now I'm drinking one just like a normal cab from Mendoza, and it's quite good. So you can get very, very good wines here that would be very difficult to get in Mexico. And then the other thing I was going to mention was they drink Fernet here. If anyone's been to Argentina, they know that Fernet with Coca-Cola is one of the big drinks in Argentina. Fernet is a liqueur that's originally from Italy, and it's actually pretty popular here in Paraguay as well. If you go to any bar, you can get a Fernet, and you cannot get a mezcal here. You cannot really. I guess they probably have a bit of tequila, but yeah. So I'd say the big drinks here are Fernet, wine, beer, and cachaça, which also comes from Brazil. So cachaça is really good. It's kind of, I guess, and they also have caña, which is similar. Caña is like a local Paraguayan liquor that's like a fermented sugar-based alcohol. I guess pretty similar to cachaça. So I guess basically any alcohol from Argentina or Brazil you're going to be able to get here. And I guess that's another cool thing about Paraguay is they have both. So maybe you're more of a Argentina-style drinker, or maybe you're more of a Brazil-style drinker. And they have both of those styles here in Paraguay, as well as the German beer. So that's kind of the alcohol vibes. I guess I originally got to talking about alcohol by mentioning nightlife. Paraguay is really good for nightlife, I mean, there's not a lot to do here because there's no ocean, right? So people go out a lot, people party. You go out, and it's going to be cheaper to go out here than it is in Mexico, although Mexico can be pretty cheap to go out as well. I'd say it's like nearly a tie. It's just classic Latin America. You can stay out and party till 5 a.m. easily, no problem. You don't have to spend a lot of money. I would say that Paraguay is a lot cheaper to go out overall. Both are good. Both places, listen to reggaeton. Here in Paraguay, you might hear more Brazilian music in the playlist and also a little bit of Argentine rock. I like when they do the Brazilian funk songs here in Paraguay, and you don't get that much in Mexico. But yeah, that's probably enough about that. Okay, gyms. I'll mention gyms. So at least here in Asunción, and I think really the big three cities, Ciudad del Este and Encarnacion, they have very solid first world gyms with air conditioning, first world equipment, just very good gyms, right? For a very cheap price. We're talking like $20 a month, $30 a month, pretty cheap. Whereas in Mexico, there's less of a gym culture, I would say overall, and there are good gyms in Mexico City. They're pretty expensive, but there are good gyms. But once you go to like tier B cities, like you go to Puebla, you go to other places, the gyms in Mexico are terrible, like everywhere. Some of the places might have a smart fit, which kind of sucks, but kind of passable. But other than that, like the gyms are often terrible, and it's kind of hit or miss on the cities. So I would say that the gyms here in Paraguay are better. I would say overall, Paraguay has more of a fitness culture than Mexico. I think maybe just they drink less Coca-Cola here. And maybe it's the influence of Brazil, because Brazil has a really big gym culture. I'm sure there's a lot of theories as to why that is, but I would say there's overall more of a fitness and gym culture in Paraguay, less fat people in Paraguay, less obesity in Paraguay. I get also people eat less candy here. In Mexico, people just eat candy and like insanely crappy food for you. But just the gyms suck. Like a lot of the gyms in Mexico are just so bad. It's unbelievable. Obviously, if you're in Playa del Carmen, or some of the gringo type cities, you'll be able to find a half decent gym. But if you go to like a non-gringo city, you're looking at like super third world gyms, like so insanely bad. I'm like, oh my god. So I guess Paraguay wins in terms of gyms, and then in terms of lower obesity, and in terms of people just not being fat and taking more care of themselves, right? Okay, so I kind of blended two in one there. Hey everybody, quick break from the podcast to tell you about Language Blend, the best new way to learn Spanish. Language Blend was co-founded by Jake Nomada, friend of the podcast, decade of experience in Latin America, and Jake and his team, they put everything into this program that they wish they had in terms of how to level up quickly with your Spanish language skills. Because the faster that you can get conversationally fluent in Spanish, the better the experience that you're going to have in Latin America. So go to languageblend.com for more information. Okay, another one is friendliness. So friendliness is interesting because a lot of people consider Mexico basically the friendliest country in the world. And Mexicans are very friendly, but I would actually argue that Paraguayans are significantly friendlier. Every traveler that has come to Paraguay, every traveler that has come to Paraguay agrees that Paraguay is one of the friendliest countries that they've ever traveled to. Like people who have been to every country in the world, people who have been to 100 plus countries, they all say Paraguay, one of the friendliest countries I've ever been to. Now, Mexicans are very friendly, but here's the issue, is that Mexico is significantly more unsafe. I guess I should probably touch upon safety later, but Mexico is significantly more unsafe than Paraguay, and partly for that reason, I think there's a little bit more of a barrier. Because, people are kind of cautious about like kidnapping and just like not trusting strangers. And for that reason, Mexicans are very friendly. They have good manners, but they don't cross that barrier often. You know what I mean? Like how would I put this? It's like when I'm in Paraguay, like if someone comes by the place to drop off a fridge or do some work in the apartment, like they're all such bros and they're like, dude, let's go have a beer, blah, blah, blah. And I actually want to have a beer with them. They actually seem like cool people. But in Mexico, if someone comes by the house to drop off a fridge or whatever, they probably are not going to say, let's go for a beer. And if they do, I'm probably going to be like, I don't even really want to have a beer with that dude. I don't know. You know what I mean? So I would say like the bro factor or like the relatability factor or friendliness factor, it's kind of a mix of things, but Paraguay just kind of wins in terms of like when you meet random people, you're more like, yeah, I'm actually down to get this guy's WhatsApp and hang out with this person. You know what I mean? Whereas in Mexico, people will be like really nice, but it's like, do I really want to get this guy's WhatsApp and hang out with this person? Like not as much. You know what I mean? It's kind of hard to explain. But it's definitely a thing. It's hard to explain. And another layer I would add to that would be like in the US and Canada, let's just say someone came to deliver a fridge to your place in New York City. They'd probably actually be kind of a bro, but you wouldn't cross that barrier in terms of like, you wouldn't be like, hey man, give me your number. Let's like go for a drink. Like just trying to make friends. I'm not, you know what I mean? Like they might be kind of like a bro-ish person or like a amicable person, but you wouldn't really cross that barrier and actually end up hanging out. Whereas in Paraguay, like when some guy comes by, they're like, yeah, man, you got to come out. We're going to go to karaoke, blah, blah, blah. And you're like, shit, that actually like sounds fun. So I would say Paraguay actually just wins overall in terms of like almost anywhere I've been, just in terms of people being like bros or cool and being down to like hang out, or they'll invite you to an asado, they'll invite you to a barbecue, and you're like, you know what, I actually kind of want to go to this barbecue, like, you know what I mean? So yeah, so that's that. Okay, so I guess that leads into safety. Paraguay, yeah, hands down, Paraguay is much safer than Mexico. I think that should be obvious. Mexico is just not as safe. Obviously, there are things you can do in Mexico, precautions you can take to have a safer life there, and you definitely can be safe in Mexico. For the most part, in Mexico, they're not really targeting expats. They're not really targeting retirees. If you're listening to this and you're still in Canada, the USA, like, look, I don't think you should let safety be a factor that's holding you back from making the move. Definitely still do it. And actually, in a lot of ways, I would argue that Mexico is safer than Canada and the USA. That being said, in Mexico, at the edges, crazy shit does happen. Whereas I feel like in Paraguay, just less crazy shit happens. And I overall feel a lot safer here. I think you'll find that in Asuncion, walking around, especially in the nicer areas, you will feel safer in Asuncion than you feel in almost any American city. It's very, very safe here. It's not to say that there aren't some like cell phone robberies or whatever, but if you take basic precautions, you'll be fine. I would definitely say Paraguay is a safer country overall than Canada, a safer country than the USA, safer country than France, right? Mexico, a little more debatable, right? I think Mexico can still be safe, but Paraguay definitely wins. Okay. Hi, what else? So, prices, cost of living overall. Paraguay is definitely way cheaper overall, especially if you're comparing Asuncion to most larger cities in Mexico. You know, the Mexican pesos kind of raised a lot relative to American and Canadian currencies recently. So Mexico is not as cheap as it once was. That being said, it's still going to be shockingly cheap compared to the US or Canada. A rule of thumb, if you're coming from Canada to the US, Mexico is probably going to be easily more than 50% cheaper. And if you go to a tier B city, or you get a good deal on rent, it could easily be 70 or 80% cheaper. In other words, like 1/5 the price, 1/4 the price. Especially when you're talking about healthcare, that's going to be a lot cheaper. What else? Uber is a lot cheaper. Food is a lot cheaper. Rent is a lot cheaper. National flights are cheaper. Basically everything is cheaper in Mexico than it is in Canada and the US. So Mexico is still a very good deal. But that being said, Paraguay is even cheaper. Like, Paraguay is unbelievably cheap. You can get an extremely nice apartment for $300-$400 a month. You can eat steak and eggs for breakfast for $2-$3, right? Paraguay is just unbelievably cheap. It's one of the cheapest countries in Latin America, for sure. With Mexico, your mileage will vary because tourist areas are going to be more expensive. Mexico City is a little bit more expensive. Once you get to tier B and tier C cities, the price chops in half again. So let's just say that Playa del Carmen or Mexico City is maybe half the price of Canada, USA. But then if you went to a tier B city like Puebla, Guadalajara, Leon, just like an average normal city with not too many tourists, that'll chop in half again. So call it like 1/4, right? Where you can easily get by with less than $2,000 a month. Paraguay, you could easily get by with less than $1,000 a month. Easily. So yeah, Paraguay wins on cost of living. Obviously, it's a little further, and the flight to get here is going to be more expensive, right? Depending on if you get a good flight, it'll probably cost you like, I don't know, over $500 for a one-way flight here, maybe even like $800. Whereas Mexico can be super cheap, especially from the States to fly. Okay, so we'll hit on a couple more things, and then we'll get to wrapping up the episode. One thing people ask about is medical freedom and kind of freedom from vaccines. I would say Paraguay is definitely the clear winner here. Mexico's very good as well. Mexico's obviously very good during the pandemic. But I would say Paraguay just wins overall in terms of like total government freedom. Whereas Mexico, they might still try to impose some vaccines on you, or I don't know, just like government imposing on you a little bit. Whereas in Paraguay, it's just like freedom, freedom, freedom. From a medical perspective, from a religious freedom perspective, whatever it is, right? Like there used to be like more cults and like religious sects and stuff in Mexico. Maybe you've heard of like the like American Mormons and Mennonites and whatever that moved to Mexico, and then they kind of got ran out of Mexico by the cartels and stuff. Well, and I think a lot of them moved to Nicaragua, but in Paraguay, you can practice whatever religion you want. You can have a weird, crazy sex cult here if you if you want in Paraguay, all that type of stuff. So, most from a freedom perspective, both countries are miles ahead of Canada and the USA. But I would also give the torch to Paraguay on that, just in terms of like overall freedoms and freedom from government. Definitely Paraguay wins on that. Okay, what else? So nomad, expat, entrepreneurial communities. This one definitely we're going to give to Mexico, right? You have much more developed capital markets, financial markets in Mexico. If you have a startup, you can raise money in Mexico probably easier. There's definitely a lot more digital nomads in Mexico. There's a lot more people making money online in Mexico. I would say like 100 to 1. Like it's pretty significant. You go to Playa del Carmen or Tulum, and it's probably the highest density, the highest concentration of entrepreneurs on the planet. And they're solid entrepreneurs. They're not like bums. Like they're all like making decent money. They're doing good stuff. They're making good money, right? So if you want to be around other A players, other digital nomads, other people making money online, other people in finance, other people in tech, startup community, that's going to be a lot more developed in Mexico. And the hubs for startups in Mexico would be Mexico City, Guadalajara, Playa del Carmen, Tulum. Those are probably the top cities for tech and stuff. Obviously, you know, the tech communities and digital nomad communities, there's overlap there. But some cities in Mexico are better for finance. Some are, you know, obviously there's a lot of finance and big business in Monterrey, but there's not really too many digital nomads there. So just depends on which vibe you're going for. Whereas in Paraguay, a lot of people are just chilling. Like a lot of people aren't making like big money. I would say the biggest concentration of expats and people making money online here is crypto and other basically like tax evaders. Not that they're not in like a bad way, like not like illegally tax evading, but they've moved here for tax purposes. So it's a lot of people that moved here for tax purposes, and then a lot of crypto people here because again, in terms of the government freedom and stuff, it's a lot easier to do crypto stuff here in Paraguay. Also, there's a very low cost of energy. And so there's a lot of like crypto mining, Bitcoin mining in Paraguay. So arguably maybe a bigger crypto scene in Paraguay. Maybe it's like even. But overall, not too many digital nomads here, just because like a lot of people aren't really going to come here because there's no beach. Like they might come here and get the tax residency and then dip. So I think you'll find that people like digital nomads in Mexico, they're actually living in Mexico year round, or they're actually chilling there. Whereas in Paraguay, people might come for a hot minute, get the residency and dip, and there's not too many people working online that stay here in Paraguay, except for, some crypto people who just want to like grind in peace. So overall, which country is the best for digital nomads? Which is the best for expats? Which is the best for retirees? I would say if you're a retiree, no brainer, Mexico. Paraguay is just too hot, and I just can't see. It is a long flight. I can't really see a retiree wanting to spend time in Paraguay. For digital nomads, you might, as I kind of mentioned, you might want to come get the tax residency in Paraguay and then actually end up living most of the year in Mexico. So I think a lot of people are doing a setup like that. I think Mexico is overall a lot more beginner friendly for obvious reasons. It's close to the US. English level is a little bit higher. There's going to be a lot more expats you can hang out with, right? There's WhatsApp groups, there's Facebook groups. You'll be able to, there's meetup.com groups, right? So you'll be able to kind of get in touch with the expat community a little bit easier, and they're going to be cool people. Whereas, to be completely honest, the expats in Paraguay, there's not that many, and a lot of them are either just like German people who you might not like get along with or might not have anything in common with, or a lot of them are kind of weird. Like a lot of the kind of digital nomads or random expats here are actually kind of weird, to be completely honest, because like there's not really a lot of reason to live here full time. Like, it is a sick country and it is very livable in a lot of ways. Just a lot of people don't do it. But yeah, so overall, Mexico, much more beginner friendly, much more expat friendly, more digital nomad friendly, more retiree friendly. So Mexico does win in terms of like, where should I go? People say, where should I go? You probably should go to Mexico, but tax residency in Paraguay is pretty good. And then what happens is people that come here, or people that come to Paraguay for the tax residency, they kind of realize like, oh, this country is actually a lot better than I thought it was. Like, people are friendly. It's crazy cheap. Steak, good food, good partying, blah, blah, blah. And so a lot of people end up staying here longer than they originally anticipated. And you could definitely stay here 6 months of the year and be totally content. I truly believe that. You could literally spend half the year here and be totally fine. But use that location independence that you have and get out of here from like November, December until March or April, because it's just very, very hot, like oppressively hot. And a lot of people go to Brazil. Maybe they'll go to Florianopolis. I have some buddies that do half the year in Medellin and half the year in Asuncion, or go up to Mexico, like we've been talking about. But just keep in mind that Mexico, you really could live in Mexico year round, 365 days a year, whereas in Paraguay, it would definitely be a slog from December to March, and there's almost no escaping it. Like, there's no high elevation city or anything, so there's really no escaping it. You can go to San Bernardino, which we haven't talked about. It's like a city on a lake, but it's still going to be very, very hot there, and it's going to feel like a slog, and it's also going to be boring and nothing to do. So Paraguay, awesome from a digital nomad tax residency perspective. Highly recommend it. Also highly recommend it for about 6 months a year. Highly recommend it for freedom seekers who are looking for absolute freedom. Totally underrated country in a lot of ways. Paraguay totally gets my thumbs up. I love Paraguay. I love so much about Paraguay. It's a sick, sick country, amazing country. But Mexico is going to be the better choice for most people overall. So hopefully this was a good comparison for people. Hopefully people got some value out of this episode. I'm sure there were tons of things I missed. I know I'm gonna like think back on this episode when I'm editing it or whatever and be like, I missed a couple things. But anyway, we have Telegram groups. So this is the call to action here. We have free Telegram groups that you can join. There's a Mexico-specific Telegram group, totally free. There's a Paraguay country group as well. So we have dedicated country groups for these two places. They already have like 500 members each. Join in there. You can network with people. You can say, hey, I'm around. Who's around? Let's meet up. Let's get a beer. Whatever. Everyone's meeting up. Tons of cool stuff. Trading information. So highly recommend you guys start by joining the free groups. And then also you can reach out to me, Vance, via Twitter, via Telegram, etc. And we can get you residency in Mexico or in Paraguay. And then also we have some paid group options as well if you want to get on Q&As and ask me live questions, and we can build you more of a specific game plan. There's a couple ways where you can, pay money for my time. Cool, guys. So hopefully you enjoyed this episode. Mexico versus Paraguay. This is my first solo episode. Hour and a half of me talking. Hopefully it went all right. But thank you guys for listening. This has been another episode of the My Latin Life podcast. Cheers.